So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction on our last speaker before lunch, who is Professor Dr. Dieter Daniels, who's a professor of art history and media theory at the Academy of Fine Arts in Leipzig, but who is currently a Gutenberg Fellow at the Gutenberg Forschungskolleg in Mainz with a 2-year research project on transdisciplinary video theory. Cross-disciplinary video theory. Duchamp and the concept of the ready-made figures prominently among Daniel's many publications on and activities related to art, media, and audiovisuality of the 20th and the 21st centuries. Already in 1988, he co-curated an exhibition on Duchamp at the Museum Duchamp, and book titles as Duchamp und die anderen, der Modellfall einer künstlerischen Wirkungsgeschichte in der Moderne from 1992 and From Readymade zum Cyberspace, Kunstmedien Interferenzen 2003 testifies to his continued interest in and research on Duchamp and the Readymade. So Dieter Daniels has been facilitating the production of new knowledge on the Readymade for a long time, also as an organizer of and contributor to numerous seminars critically engaging in reassessments of the concept of the Readymade. Most recently, as he has already mentioned, in October 2017, he organized an international symposium at Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin called the Readymade Century. We now all have the flyer. Focusing on contemporary ready-mades and an investigation of the heterogeneous field of post-appropriation strategies. The seminar investigated if the term ready-made needed updating in the light of global and digital transformations of the 21st century. The seminar is soon to be followed by a book authored by Daniels only, which also bears the title The Readymade Century, and the Barnes & Noble's homepage assures us that they will be available from June the 26th, so keep up, look out for it. The book, however, spans several extra perspectives. Not only does it investigate the genesis and consistency of Duchamp's concept of the ready-made in the first 50 years, from 1914 to 1964, it also describes the history of its reception, extending far beyond the artist's lifetime. Dieter has told me that he has brought a copy or a print of the book.
A preprint, so to say, yeah, like a, yeah.
So you should consult him. And today, Daniel will apply his astute mind analyzing for us the afterlife of the ready-made as post-ready-mades. So please join me in welcoming and applauding today's last speaker.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful, elaborate introduction and the wonderful conference. We can say by now, you know, as we have already seen so many aspects of this 100th century enterprise, and when I got all the resumes, I changed my project for a lecture because I thought there will be all this discussion that we had today and that is so wonderful, intense still after 100 years. And I thought to make like more, like David did, a part on the story, how it all ended for Duchamp, at least in the last years of his lifetime. And then on the ongoing legacy of what further generations have been doing with the concept that Duchamp left us and how it's developing and changing until the current day. I tried to do that in a very compressed form, and for some more elaborate reading, the book will be soon out. You know, as art historians, we are usually bound to some kind of prima vista evidence. We want to have seen what we talk about. This might be a strange introduction for talking about the ready-made, but I'll come back to that later. But try to remember, like, your first encounter with one of these objects that was labeled as a ready-made. When did that happen? In which kind of exhibition? In which kind of collection? And then afterwards we will look at it again of what that was that you have been seeing at the time you encountered this object. This is a little bit pedagogic introduction, but you'll see it's part of my kind of deconstruction enterprise. Okay. This is a typical situation where maybe these young people have first time seen what we call Readymade and some person, teacher, explaining it to them. And we have like an imaginary soundtrack of what this person is saying to them. It's in the collection presentation of the Centre Pompidou. It's like the typical setup that you will find in many other occasions around the globe. And also the labeling will be similar to what you find in other places. In the exhibition that you were so kind to mention in 1988, I was the first one maybe to try a different presentation, which is more irritating about what you see, and what you see is what you get is not exactly happening with the Readymade. You might see that there are multiple options to see something, and you're not so sure of what you should really look at. I presented like 3 different signed versions of the bottle rack by Duchamp, and then personally bought one at the Bazar de l'Hôtel de Ville. This is the one on the right with a little distance, and was allowed to present it in the premises of the Museum Ludwig. And we did a more elaborate thing in the catalogue. At the time we had the Schwarz Werkverzeichnis, like the Schwarz Complete Works, which gives a list of all the different versions, but it doesn't show them. In the edition later it was added, I'll come back to that, but at the time it was just listed. And there was no resource in '88 to get hold of the visual appearance of all these different objects that were listed in the Schwarz Complete Works. So what I did, I was like my own Google search engine. I went through all different publications. I was a student, I had lots of time at the moment, and tried to figure out which one is which. They were all labeled Bottle Rack 1914, and it was never said in most of the publication what we actually see. And only by a difficult kind of research process and counting mostly the pins, this is my best criterion of making sure what is what, I finally could filter out all these images without having seen the objects themselves. And then we got those for loan, and I proved that I was right, because the catalog was printed already. When we unpacked those, they were the ones I was expecting to be. Sometimes also in correspondence with the collectors, but sometimes not. And you see on the left side are the versions signed by Duchamp that somebody has bought Readymade, most of the time not Duchamp himself, but somebody he delegated to buying it. And on the right side you see this whole other history, starting with the 1936 photograph of then freshly chosen bottle rack for the Raton exhibition that you were showing, Glenn, photographed by Man Ray to be incorporated in the bottle racks, which then served as a model for the rebuilt objects, not bought but remade objects, first by Ulf Linde around uppers, and then in the edition of Arturo Schwarz down here. And then this again is photographed or rephotographed for this wonderful Shadows of Shadows for the Octavio Paz book, the Ombre Portée, which will serve as a cover for my little booklet, because it's all this transformation process in the final stage. So this was the first time that the visual differences appeared on a surface in print that you had to compile from various sources, and which became a standard after a while. Arturo Schwarz adopted that in his complete works in 2000 of showing these possible differences. Have you ever seen a Readymade? Well, the question becomes more complex, as you see now, because what the later stage of these Readymades is, they are built objects for which these designs were made, that were made after supposedly photographs of the originals. And if you go now for the simple image search, Duchamp Fountain, most of what you get is a multiple of 1964, which actually is not a Readymade, but was built after these drawings, after the Stieglitz photo we discussed already. And it imposes himself on all the other versions, and the algorithms by Google prefer always like an identical object instead of diversity, which is existing on the sides of the things that were chosen and or signed by Duchamp. These multiples have been editioned in 1964 in an edition of 8 copies, plus 2 artists, plus two exhibition copies, which is 14 by 12 in a whole like 168 objects without crowding the museums. And whenever you have had your first Readymade experience, I'm almost 99% sure that this was one of the objects you encountered. And the same happens when you go to the web also for the bottle rack. You have now this kind of standardized form which replaces the possibility indeterminacy on the side of Duchamp's choice. And coming now to the question, what do we really see if we see such an object? The wonderful analysis we had of the blind man page already indicates by Thierry the important role of the photograph. The photograph is the most important trace we have of this lost object, and the photograph served as the source for the blueprint to produce the multiples. So the long lost object retroactively gets accorded the status of an original, which it didn't have because in other occasions Duchamp chose other objects and found them as valid as to replace the lost object as it did. It only becomes an original through this funny process of transformation and of reconstructing something handmade instead of ready-made in 1964. So what do we see if we look at this multiple which you encounter in most of the cases you go to in an exhibition? In the case of Fountain, we see the three-dimensional reconstruction of a long-lost urinal after the photograph by Alfred Stieglitz from 1917, after the section drawings of an Italian technical draftsman, both on this photo, cast in porcelain from this drawing by a manufacturer of sanitary goods in 1964. That is a ready-made to look at when you come into a kind of typical exhibition of Duchamp's Fountain in any kind of the museum which harvests one of the copies of this edition of 1964. So it's a whole cascade of processes of appropriation, and I call them, funny enough, Duchamp's self-appropriation, not knowing that you would talk about self-appropriation in the later history of the ready-made idea. I coined that for his kind of own strategy because it's absolutely like the contrary of a ready-made already, what we see if we kind of mentally adapt to the complex process to the object we're looking at. And same is true for the bottle rack, but even more complex, because of the bottle rack we don't have a photograph of the lost original of 1914. Nobody knows how it looks. We only have the object from 1936, photographed by Man Ray, and then also afterwards lost. So again, the photo is the blueprint for the blueprint. You know, the blueprint is modeled after the photograph. There is no original, although Schwarz in the complete works pretends, and it's always repeated everywhere, they are done after photos of the originals. It's not true. Schwarz later corrected that and said sometimes, in some cases, after the original. So what we see is like a high level of fictionalized object, and in the Bois d'Anvalise it's only called Readymade, by the way. It doesn't have a title, and it says Paris 1914, collection of Man Ray. It doesn't say photo by Man Ray, and it doesn't say chosen in 1936. So Duchamp had a part in this kind of fictionalizing element of the originality of the piece. So what we see in this step of the bottle dryer, it is the three-dimensional reconstruction of a lost object that has left no photographic record after an idea by Marcel Duchamp from 1914, after a later chosen replica of this idea from 1936, after the photograph of this replica by Man Ray from the same year, and after section drawings that a technical Italian draftsman based on this photo. Finally, the object was produced from these drawings in some Italian workshop in 1964. That is what we see in the typical exhibition copy of the bottle rack. So this kind of self-appropriation process can be, in a way, compared to appropriation art as a strategy. And it never has been made very kind of fruitful that the appropriation by Duchamp was maybe like a possible model for later appropriations of not self, but alien appropriations, so to differentiate them from the self-appropriations. And it can be, for example, compared this Duchamp after Man Ray, after the bottle rag process with Cherry Levine after Walker Evans, the seminal show in 1981. And we could call these multiples a completely new type, new genre of work, a post-ready-made. It's the Duchamp after Duchamp. This is the end result of this self-appropriation cascade that I was explaining to you. We have these similar convoluted stages of authorship in appropriation art in Cherry Levine and Walker Evans, and also in many other works of the time. And Duchamp remakes were similarly based on photos of the bottle dryer and or the urinal by prominent photographers, by Man Ray and Alfred Stieglitz, replacing Walker Evans in the work of Cherry Levine now. And they are an act of self-appropriation which at the time was so unique that maybe only through the lens of the later developments of appropriation we can see it at appropriation, because it was hidden under the status of being a ready-made at the time he did it. So we only through the later development discover its potential of being appropriation at the time, as appropriation of second or third degree, because the ready-made, as David has said, in itself already was appropriation of the object. And this kind of remediated reappropriation of the own appropriative act 50 years after. It's important, this 50 years, because to switch now to the further development, the post-Duchampian development, Duchamp chose explicitly the year 1964 as the 50th anniversary of the bottle rag. So it was meant to be like a mid-century mark, and including the possibility that the rest of the century would be filled up with other possible options ongoing. I think this slide also says it. And then we have this pure and funny coincidence that the same year these multiples are launched, also Andy Warhol launches his Brillo boxes, both happening in 1964, independently from any other causal relation, maybe without, most probably without knowing about the other's activities. And so we have now two types of ready-made remakes, which both mark this second half of the century. The one is the old story of the ready-made by Duchamp, and the other one is this new kind of ready-made as remake, because there are no originals to the Brillo boxes. They are remakes right from the start. They never were chosen as boxes to pack something in. They were made up by Warhol, and they were presented as if they were real boxes in a stack like in a supermarket, but in fact they were all produced by silkscreen on wooden boxes. So they are the same strategy of redoing a consumer good, making it look like it is something you bought from the shelf, but it's not. There's a lot of irritation potential in combining the ready-made with the Brillo boxes, and you could do a symposium only about the relation of the Brillo boxes to the ready-made. We cannot invite Arthur Denti anymore, but he has been intrigued about this comparison for a longer part of his life. It's interesting that he really comes back and back again. In his last book, he's coming back to this topic again, you know. And he's kind of always re-shrinking and reframing it, you know. And there is some criticism also, like Juliane Redentisch, a prominent German author, has criticized his approach of taking the Brillo box as a starting point for essentially a non-ontological definition of art, that's what he tried to find. That she said he's wrong because he compares the Brillo boxes to the ready-mades, and the Brillo boxes are made and the ready-mades are not. But Juliane Readymade, their colleague, is as wrong as he is, because she doesn't consider that the Readymades are as multiples at the time they shown in 64, are as well artifacts made on the higher level of elaboration, but still as much fake objects, fake consumer goods as the Brillo boxes are. So this makes it much more interesting in a certain way. The comparison that Dante didn't do, and that I think nobody really has been thinking about, that we are now having all in the second half of the 20th century to deal with these fake consumer goods labeled as ready-made, which they are not. Okay, so how does the story go on for the multiples of the ready-made? A little bit Duchamp, and then I'm ending up with the contemporary practices. The 168 ready-mades that were done as multiples were quite successful. They were making a world tour right after 64. You will find a list in my book, like they were throughout Europe, throughout USA and Canada. They entered Australia and even New Zealand. So suddenly there was this presence of these long lost objects in the second half of this century. They were kind of reimaginated museum exhibits which they never have been before, and became how this process of canonization and also of commodification themselves. And in contrast to the seriality of the Warhol pieces, they always presented as unique, as you see here. They are unique on a pedestal, and that is how this kind of standardized presentation form from the Stieglitz photo becomes suddenly like the way to show the fountain, although we have seen diverse photos where it's hanging and doing other things throughout the first half of his century life, and suddenly it becomes an object to be posed on a pedestal, similar in the way Stieglitz has photographed this. Before it was more deliberate, it had more chances to unfold itself, and now it becomes that. And Duchamp didn't intervene in these exhibitions. I just did some research on the Kästner exhibitions. They're publishing a catalog on the Duchamp show which they had. He just had other people do that. He had Schwartz do that, you know. And you can see also that there are funny coincidences just for the Duchampians among us. On the left, you see him posing in the Hommage à Marcel Duchamp, where the ready-made multiples were launched. But on the pedestal, you see the copy made by Ulf Linde, because the ready-made was still in process. The ceramic factory didn't deliver in time. And then you see him posing with the multiple done by Schwartz a couple of months later in Hanover. And he just said, he now becomes like this kind of, this is me in my piece photographs, you know, and his prominent photographs. One is Ugo Mullas and one is Umbo. So there becomes this kind of, the artist and his creation photographs which inform a lot of our thinking about Duchamp and his ready-mades, you know, these iconic figures, this wonderful, great-looking French man with a smile on his face, and that what he did, what he didn't do, what others did for him in the evidence of the objects, none of them were hand-selected or even chosen by him. None of them were signed. The mud wasn't labeled by him. It was all done by others, you know, and he just stands there and say, look at me, look at that, look how nice it is, you know, whatever it is by Ulf Linde, by Schwartz, you know, so. Okay, this is not so serious now. Coming now to the rest of the century in a quick rush. There are other artists picking on the ready-made strategy, and some of them do the same kind of funny shift. Because following today's terminology, Duchamp's strategy concerning the ready-mades around the time of their conception was to evade the principle of the art market. In the interviews with Tompkins, he says, it was really to get out of the exchangeability. I meant the monetization, one might say, of the work of art. I never intended to sell my ready-mades. Then, it's 1964, they are now on sale as multiples, and Tompkins is asking back again, I think, how you mean that, you know? And then he said, never did I sell them. So he insists on that, not selling, you know. talking about the original conception of the piece, while the multiples are on sale. And there seems to be a kind of repetition of this happening in the appropriation art a decade later. That, for example, Sherry Levine, in her early days, by some coincidence, acquired a whole set of children's shoes, very cheap, on a jumbo sale somewhere. And then she decided in one of her first solo precision shows to make this shoe sale, where she is, as an artist, reselling these shoes which she bought, 77. So these are ready-made objects put on sale as a conceptual appropriation gesture of Sherry Levine of these man-made things. And then, 92, like now it's getting short to the time of commercialization, commodification, she's asked by Parquet to do an edition referring back to her 1977 edition. These ones were all sold and gone, and they have been looking for a while for similar objects to replace those, but they didn't find any, so they asked a shoemaker now to do this. So this whole story of redoing something that has been ready-made before now is compressed in the time from 77 to 92. And you have this wonderful blurb by Parquet, a refined version handmade in Italy from softest leather and sweet retraces the artist's first step. That's how it comes. And you see on the Parquet website it is still there and it's out of print. As it says here in the left corner, that means it's sold out. Out of print is a funny thing for a shoe to be out of print, but anyway, you know what it says. And again, we have this Italian wonderful craftsmanship which is doing those things like the freshly produced ready-made strategies, rehistoricizing something no longer available in its physical evidence. And we have seen that in a single shot of a single object. And it is interesting how Sherry Levine presented this remade, ready-made, which now is much more evident because it's like bronze sculpture, it's cast, you know. And you immediately see that it's not a fountain that is bought, it's not meant to use, it will never have any kind of P in it. And in the first presentation she did was in the Mary Boone Gallery when it was initiated in '91. She had 3 copies. I don't have a photo of this one. And in the following exhibition tour, which started in Zurich and had like 5-6 places, she presented all 6 of them. It was an edition of 6 bronze casts, which is like the usual edition you would have of a Rodin bronze cast too. And they were presented simultaneously to show like this is a multiple. You know? This is a multiple referring to a lost original, which again by Duchamp was cast in porcelain, and I'm casting that in bronze. And I'm almost sure that it has some play on the multiple status of the multiple remakes by Schwartz from '64. I can't prove that, and I tried to contact Sherry Levine, but she's not kind of very easy accessible. If anybody has a chance, please ask her if she had in mind this multiple edition. And what she does, she takes out the singularity of the Duchamp presentation which she has, and for one moment, for this tournée, she shows all 6 to explain that it's not a single object. But then they spliced up through the art methods. They sold, and now they start their life on their own, and they kind of survive as unique sculptures then, losing this very interesting set of their multiple identity afterwards. And a little bit later, Ellen Sturtevant does the same. In her retrospective in the Moderna Museum in Stockholm, she redid the single version of the 1992 Fresh Widow remake and made 9 of them and presented them simultaneously. And funny enough, it's the same museum which harvests the replica made by Ulf Linde and signed by Duchamp in 1961. And I was corresponding with the Moderna Museum to find out, on this photograph we only see Sturtevant, or whether they smuggled Duchamp in the Sturtevant. No, they said it's all pure Sturtevant, and the Duchamp was somewhere else or not on display, but it's not part of this photograph. But you see how irritating this whole story of redoing objects might become, for me as a researcher, looking at that, where you can identify which one is a Duchamp, which one is a Sturtevant, which one is a Ulf Linde, and whoever did what, you know. And, so now we have a wrap-up of what's been happening since then, and there's another handout which you can maybe give in the round here, this kind of list here, which I prepared.
Hasn't that been circulated?
Yeah, you have been circulating it. This is just like a little excuse for not talking about all of what that's coming, which would like explode the time frame of this lecture, to show you the craze of the Readymade that's taking off after Duchamp's death, you know. And I limited it to 1988 to 2000, because 1987 was the Duchamp centennial. That was the occasion why I did the Museum Ludwig exhibition at the time. And then 2018 is like the Readymade centennial, or the last kind of flickering of the Readymade centennial with the Fountain centennial 2017. And I never saw all these exhibitions. Some of them have catalogs, some have not. But if you would compile all these pieces that have been in there, you would get like an incredible load of things and a variety of produced, reproduced, quoted, taken, given, imagined, possibly, strategies of the Readymade. And there has been an artist who did a similar comment early on in 1997. John Armleder did this wonderful accumulation of Readymades of the 20th century. And what you see here already is a double page from my book. And I was able to track the list on the right in German of all the objects that are part of his kind of Readymade Gesamtkunstwerk, so to say. And then each occasion it is done, the gallerist has to go and get these things. You know, it's like a modular installation. Once it's done, it might be sold. For example, the upper one is in part of the Mercedes-Benz collection in Stuttgart/Berlin, and the lower one was at the gallery in Bruno Bischofsberger, but it's completely different, as you see, although the list is always like what should be in, but then it looks different of what people buy. You know, there are different refrigerators, different, which refer back to different balls referring back to Jeff Koons, you know. You will see, like neon tubes referring back to Dan Flavin and all that. Okay. And so the last artist to end up with a totally contemporary position is the Sadan Afif Fountain Archives project, which he started in 2008. And he collects every possible printed illustration of the fountain in any books of any language he can get hold of. And the aim is to have 1001 of them, like the mystery of the ongoing tales of 1001 nights, you know, told in fountain illustrations. And he has built up a whole network of people helping him and bringing in, like from the most remote places of the world, these kind of illustrations. I had one he didn't have, which I contributed from a very early student time text of mine. And he's now approaching this 1001. He's closing the project. And what he does now, he does this wonderful accrochages, and they continue the pluralism that was lost, as I showed earlier on in my lecture, in the standardization of the Schwarz multiple, being like the typology of this single object, which seemingly is modeled after the original, as the case of the bottle rack. We know that is no original, and he is kind of remultiplying now the appearance of the fountain. And then you see there is all these quotes from books, and you have quotes of other quotes. On the right side you might have seen this image. It's taken from the Schwarz complete works. I've been showing that before. And now we have like Ridwan Akin talking about Schwarz and about his presentation of the Readymade, putting that in his book Speculations, Aesthetics of the 21st Century in 2014, reprinting the Schwarz and so entering another time the archive. And as I will have this example also in my book, this is another double page from my book. I'm taking the right one, which is the Reed van Akin book, quoting the Schwartz complete work. And this is the double spread of my book, where I put the Sadhana fifth page of the Reed van Akin quoting the Schwartz thing. And this one now will go into Sadhana's project. He reserved a slot in the 1001 books for this one, so the Schwartz one will be in the third time, and he has created a special augmented section, section augmentée, you can check it on the web, where now within these books that he is harvesting, there are coming all these books that talk about his work. And not about the fountain, but as the fountain as reproduced and collected by Sadhana Fifth. So this puts in another level, or another turn, or another twist in this whole story of reproduction. And it was so nice for him to say to me, I kept a place on the FA, on the Fountain Archive shelves for you. And we suddenly have this, at the end of this lecture and of this century story, this interference between the ongoing practice of the revisiting of the Readymade and of the research from my part in this century history, and they will in one moment in the future, when this will be inserted in his archive, for a second they will match as a short rendezvous. Thank you so far.